Now that our project is complete, the last thing we need to do is publish it to Orchestrator. That means that we'll be able to run it remotely, run it on different machines, and also schedule jobs. The key thing to note is that the first XAML file that will be seen by Orchestrator is typically the main.xaml file. This is the default. If we look in our project folder, we're able to see that there's a project.json file. If you edit this, you can edit this by opening it with Notepad. And you can see that the main file that's being seen is the main.xml file. We're going to leave that as it is, but for some reason, if you wanted to change that to a different file in your project, then here's where you would edit it. However, industry standard is that main.xml is the first point of contact for the state machine and the robotic enterprise framework. So it's good practice just to leave it as that, because if you pick up someone else's process, you'll know exactly where to start. Let's click publish. And let's put some notes in. So Acme Academy process published by Richard. Click OK to publish it, and hopefully we'll get a pop-up message saying that it's been published successfully. Great stuff. Now let's go to Orchestrator. Look at our processes. We already have our test orchestrator, which we loaded earlier in the series. If we refresh and click the plus sign, we can now select our Acme Academy process. Click Create. Now let's go to Jobs. Click Start. Select Acme Academy process and LinkedIn environment. Select our LinkedIn machine. Start. And the job will start in the background. You see the UI robot exec file icon pop up. And we see the robot start. In this case, there are no items to process. The robot simply logs out, closes the application down, and we're returned back to the main window. So, if you've made it this far, you'll be pleased to know that we've completed our project in full. I hope you found it useful. I'm just going to do a quick recap to explain all of the things that we've covered, and maybe to give you a few prompters as to where to look for information if you get stuck or have got stuck. And also give you a few pointers in case you get stuck in the future. So the first thing we did was we created our brand new project and we selected the Robotic Enterprise Framework. Over the duration of the course, I introduced you to the framework and we started to understand how the applications would be initialized using the Acme login component and some of the framework workflows such as initialize all applications and initialize all settings. We then went into the get transaction state, where we started to understand how we would load information to a queue, and using the data load workflow, we were able to loop through all of our queue items after they'd been extracted from the Acme application, loaded them into an orchestrator queue, and our framework consumed all of that information, taking the WID and performing some actions based on the information that was in the queue item. When it came to finally processing the transaction, we called the process from our process transaction state. The process workflow is the workflow that does all of the work for us. First of all, we checked the date. We then navigated to the work items based on the WID that was passed through from the queue item. If the date was before 2019, we were throwing in a new business rule exception. Else, if it was after 2019, we were going to continue with the process. We then navigated to the work item details, extracted all of the information using 3 components. These components actually all used the same component, but passed in different information. So for the first component, we passed in the client ID text and received the client ID out of the component. Then we called exactly the same component, but instead of asking for the client ID, we asked for the client name. We could use this component multiple times depending on the information that we want to extract from the work item details page. After we'd extracted the work item details, we invoked the SHA1 generate hash component. This opened up the website, input the client ID, customer name, and customer country, and generated a hash code, which we then used to update the work items in the Acme Academy. That was our process. Once our process had finished running, the output would either be a success, a business rule exception, or an error. What we saw is that the framework handles each of these. If the case was successful, it simply moves to the next case. If there was a business rule exception, then again, there's nothing for the robot to do, but it would mark the case as a business exception in Orchestrator. And if it was a system exception, it would not only mark the case as a system exception, but it would also restart the robot, closing down all of the applications and reinitializing them. We made a couple of additions to the framework. One was to create a report using the generic create report component. We placed this in the finally section of the process transaction state and generated a daily report for each of the work items. Once the robot has finished processing all of the work item cases, the process will be stopped, but prior to doing that, we would send an email to any particular user based on information provided in the config file, and the email would contain an attachment with all of the work items and the status of whether they were successful or whether there was an application or system exception. We also had a really good look into Orchestrator. We linked up our robot for the first time, we set up the machines and the environments, and we added our process. We added a number of assets, including credentials for the Acme Academy and credentials for Gmail, and also had an asset called the sh31 URL. Generally, it's your decision as to whether you have an asset held in Orchestrator or whether you use the config file. There may be different situations where one is better than the other. We also had a look at the queue. We loaded all of the information into the Acme queue with the WID and with the date. We saw numerous results for these cases. We saw many which were successful and many which were failed, depending on the business rules or the system exceptions that they encountered. And that's pretty much it. So we've completed our full project. We've built it in a way that's both robust, scalable, and maintainable because it's easy to debug where problems are. You could see that with any problem we encountered, we were easily able to fix it. So now we're at the end of our project. Thank you so much for getting this far in the course, and I hope you found it helpful. What I want to do now is just recommend some next steps. There's a lot of activities that we didn't use within the project, and I would recommend that you browse through those in UiPath. Additionally, if you haven't already done the foundation course within the Academy, you can find it on the uipath.com website, and there are a number of resources here, but the Academy can be found on the Academy page. If you navigate to the RPA Academy, you can sign up and take any number of courses and get certifications in UiPath. Additionally, you can go to UiPath Connect, which is a network of all of the various UiPath developers around the world, and also links into UiPath Go, which is an area where you can save and find existing projects that the community have created. Also on the UiPath website, you can find a link to the community forum, which is where you can get some of your questions answered from experienced users. The forum looks like this, and never be afraid to ask any questions. People are very friendly and they will always come back to you with sensible answers. You'll also find that there are a lot of answers already out there from things that people have struggled with in the past. So make sure that you search the forum before asking a new question. Finally, you have the resources section, which contains a whole load of documentation about many of the features of UiPath Studio, Robot, and Orchestrator. In particular, if you look at the Orchestrator guide, you have tons of information and documentation about hardware and software requirements for the information, recommendations on how to deploy all of the servers and virtual machine setup, and many other things around licensing and tenancy, etc. If you're struggling with any particular syntax in .NET, you can very easily just Google the answer. So, for example, if you didn't know how the try-parse-exact method worked, simply Google datetime.tryparseexact, and you should be taken to the Microsoft.NET website, where you get examples of how the datetime.tryparseexact, or whichever method you're trying to use, or information about whichever method you're trying to use. At the very bottom, you get an example of exactly how to use that particular method. And finally, there's a very good Visual Basic Essential training course, which can be found on the LinkedIn Learning. So as you're already subscribed to the LinkedIn Learning, you should have access to this course, and I would recommend that you get a really good understanding of the .NET syntax if you don't already. Thank you so much for taking this course. It's been an absolute pleasure to deliver it. I hope you enjoyed it and have learned a lot, and I wish you all the best with all of your future UiPath projects.